The first treatise of government is a demolishment of divine right theory, which is the idea basically that the monarch was anointed by the divine power and receives his power in that way and rules through divine authority. There are various renditions of it, and he takes on a particular one. That theory is of Sir Robert Filmer, and he summarizes his reaction to it at the very beginning of the second treatise. So he says right at the very start of the second treatise, "It having been shown in the foregoing discourse that Adam had not, either by natural right of fatherhood or by positive donation from God, any such authority over his children or dominion over the world as is pretended. 2, that if he had, his heirs yet had no right to it. And 3, that if his heirs had, there being no law of nature nor positive law of God that determines which is the right heir in all cases that may arise, the right of succession and consequently of bearing rule could not have been certainly determined." And he goes on. So you get some sense of Filmer's argument right there, that God first anointed Adam ruler over all, and then somehow the power of God's authority was passed on from Adam to his children, his heirs, and then to their heirs, and so on. And so there's this lineage, or this almost like apostolic succession of monarchical power. But Locke, of course, argues that you just can't trace it. Even he says, grant, for the sake of argument, that God did give this to Adam, although he sounds like he is not sure of that. Nevertheless, to go on to extrapolate from there that that authority was meant to be passed down, or somehow God gave all the heirs of Adam and their heirs this type of authority, and then that a monarch could trace his lineage or his authority back to Adam, he basically says, prove it. So that's really all I need to say about the first treatise. It gives you an idea that Locke is not going to go in that direction, that he's not going to establish government power on the basis of God's authority. And he follows Thomas Hobbes in this regard, because Hobbes also basically argued that we needed a new foundation for establishing civil government. The power and authority of civil government had to come from human beings and not from God. Basically, Hobbes and Locke, in turn, were influenced by the scientific revolution and by the first glimmers of the Enlightenment, and as such didn't necessarily reject God. Arguably, even Thomas Hobbes wasn't an atheist. Certainly Locke wasn't an atheist. But they were no longer willing to connect civil power or laws directly to God. Instead, they needed to show that it came from human choice. And Hobbes first constructed the social contract theory that Locke then takes up and transforms and makes his own. But let me back up and start to follow Locke's reasoning. He next distinguishes political power from other forms of authority, other than God's, that have something in common, at least at the time, with the type of authority that God and the priest or the church had over people. So he distinguishes political power from, he says, that of a father over his children, a master over his servant, a husband over his wife, and a lord over his slave. All of these relationships have something, in his mind, organic about them. They're natural relationships and relationships of natural authority, or that people take for natural authority. They have to do with some superiority. In the case of the father over his children, it's age, the master over his servant, it's power, the husband over his wife, it's a contractual authority of sorts. We'll be getting into that when we get to that point in the second treatise. He has an interesting view about the authority of the husband over his wife. And the lord over his slave, power, and perhaps a certain superiority in his mind. So he ends the first chapter by concluding political power, then, I take to be a right of making laws with penalties of death, and consequently all less penalties, for the regulating and preserving of property, and of employing the force of the community in the execution of such laws, and in the defense of the Commonwealth from foreign injury, and all this only for the public good. So we can see that he calls it a right of making laws. He does not say that it is a duty. He doesn't say it's an obligation. It's not a natural authority. And notice also that all of the things that this political power is supposed to do have to do with concrete things needed for the community to be safe and prosperous. They don't have to do with people's spiritual health. It don't have to do with worship. Now, having made that statement, he needs to then back up and explain why he sees political power in this way. What is the new foundation for political power that makes it mainly or entirely secular and human? So chapter 2 is about the state of nature. What he's going to do is he's going to tell us what he thinks is the origin of political power. He's going to imagine what human beings are like in their so-called natural state, which he calls a state of perfect freedom, that is, a state without government. Now, notice right away that we get a characteristic of classical liberalism here that is debatable. Aristotle, for instance, would argue that community is natural for people, that they form it organically or naturally. It comes out of their very nature. He calls them political creatures. But Locke imagines people before government or in a state without government, somehow pre-political. And in that state they are completely free, and they are also completely equal, which is another quality of classical liberal thought, the idea that all individuals in the state of nature anyway, before government passes laws that may divide and rank them, are naturally equal. So he says of this equality, it's a state of equality wherein all the power and jurisdiction is reciprocal. This is in the state of nature still. All the power and jurisdiction is reciprocal, no one having more than another, there being nothing more evident than that creatures of the same species and rank, promiscuously born to all the same advantages of nature, and the use of the same faculties, should be equal one amongst another, without subordination or subjection, unless the Lord and Master of them all should, by any manifest declaration of his will, set one above another, and confer on him, by an evident and clear appointment, an undoubted right to dominion and sovereignty. That latter part is a reference to God. So unless God came down, in other words, and by manifestly declaring his will, so that people could see it and hear it, actually anoint a king or some lord over everybody, until that happens, all human beings are naturally equal. That is because he says they have the same advantages of nature and the use of the same faculties. He's not going to argue that they are all equal in ability, and I think that's why he uses the phrase use of the same faculties. We are all intelligent beings. If we aren't, as the case of small children, for instance, then we're in a different position and we don't quite fit this description. But here he's speaking of all people who are capable of making the later social contract. Notice again, he's not going to argue, at least not as a primary way of making his case, that human beings are equal because they're all created by God, or they're all children of God or something like that, but because they have the same advantages of nature and the use of the same faculties. In other words, we're enough like each other that there is no reason to subordinate one to the other. So in the state of nature, people are free and equal. Now, Thomas Hobbes had it that in this state of nature, with people being free and equal, as he also said, that people would be very suspicious of each other. They would anticipate that others might take their things or even want to take their life out of fear that you might do the same. And so Hobbes is famous for saying that the state of nature is a state in which life is poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In other words, it's pretty much a war of all against all, according to Hobbes. But Locke takes that state of nature and he puts his own spin on it. And this is because he views human nature somewhat differently. Hobbes really puts the emphasis on the almost antisocial nature of human beings, the aggressive self-interest and the fear that they have. But Locke seems to see human beings as much more capable of cooperation. They are not perfect, they are not all kind, good, and social, but they are more capable of cooperation and the notion of reciprocity. So he says that the state of nature will not be a state of war, or at least not all of the time, as Hobbes would have it. He says, though this be a state of liberty, yet it is not a state of license, meaning it's not a state in which people do whatever they want and take full advantage. He says, though man in that state have an uncontrollable liberty to dispose of his person or possessions, yet he has not liberty to destroy himself, or so much as any creature in his possession, but where some nobler use than its bare preservation calls for it. So here he begins to introduce a sort of law of nature, that there are some rules that people understand and can follow in the state of nature. Again, differing from Hobbes here. Hobbes said people may know the rules by which they can live peaceably with each other, but they can't follow them in the state of nature because too much fear and suspicion. But Locke here, with a more, I guess, more reasonable notion of human nature, thinks that human beings can indeed understand the law and also follow it to a certain extent. And the first thing he mentions there is that you have not the freedom to destroy yourself. And this is very important. I mean, normally we think, well, he's talking about suicide, and it's true that he argues against suicide as a misuse of yourself. And here he does fall back on God, at times he does. We were made by God, God gave us life, and we are not supposed to destroy it of our own accord. But here he has in mind also slavery and tyranny. He would say, cannot and should not give yourself over to someone that you know would then be capable of destroying you. That this runs against human nature itself. It runs against the right he will establish to life and liberty. And when we give ourselves over to somebody who can basically rule over us with an iron fist, in which we have no choice, we have in effect destroyed ourselves. So that's very important for him to mention right there. We must always be assumed to have an interest in not only our survival, but our comfortable self-preservation, and anything that tyrannizes over us and takes away our power, and as we'll see also our property, can take our lives. And that's also why he mentions any creature in our possession. We should not take advantage of or abuse the things around us, including the animals around us. And this is a law of nature which is reasonable, because if we do, we may put ourselves into a position where we cannot survive. So he says, the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone. And reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind, who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, No one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. For men, being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise Maker, all the servants of one sovereign master, sent into the world by his order, and about his business, they are his property, whose workmanship they are. Okay, so there we have a reference to God. This is where God comes in for Locke. And yet it's interesting that later on, Locke will make some moves which seem to contradict this statement a bit. He says here, human beings shouldn't abuse themselves or put themselves into danger of being abused, nor should they abuse God's nature, because all things are God's property. But when Locke gets to the point of developing how human beings acquire property, we see that he firmly comes down on the idea that human beings own and can dispose of property once they make this first step into actual property ownership. If that sounds confusing, don't worry. When we get to it, it'll probably make more sense. But I'll just say again that here Locke sounds rather pious, perhaps. He sounds like a believer, and he probably is a believer, but he doesn't follow through necessarily on the ultimate conclusions of his own argument. The fact that human beings are the property of God and that all of nature is the property of God could lead one to conclude that people cannot claim ownership over the earth and its creatures, and maybe might even conclude that they should not obtain any sort of authority or power over others, because that is for God to wield. But he doesn't go there. He kind of goes in another direction. So we have some laws of nature, such as we are bound to preserve ourselves. By our very nature, we have a right to self-preservation. And he says also, as much as we can, we have an obligation to preserve the rest of mankind. He says we may not, unless it be to do justice on an offender, take away or impair life, or what tends to the preservation of the life, liberty, health, limbs, or goods of another. And I might make mention here that is this type of terminology which inspired the phrase that Thomas Jefferson uses in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Locke famously says we have a right to life, liberty, and property. So American founders like Jefferson and great patriots of the American Revolution like Thomas Paine argued along the same lines, that human beings are the authors of their government. They have this natural freedom. They have the right to self-preservation. They have the right to resist tyranny. And so by understanding Locke's argument, we can go a long way towards understanding the thought processes of thinkers like Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine. So he says that the execution of the law of nature is in the state of nature put into every man's hands. That just means that, everybody understands there are certain rules and laws of how to get along with human beings and to try to keep the peace. But in the state of nature, there's no government over people. So if people are going to enforce the law, they have to do it themselves. And he had made a reference a little bit earlier on to basically executing justice independently. We are to preserve the rest of mankind unless we are to do justice to an offender. So that implies that in the state of nature, if somebody does wrong to us or another, we have the right to go ahead and try to punish the offender. He says every man hath the right to punish the offender and be executioner of the law of nature. I liken this for my students to the state of the Hatfields and McCoys. The state of a lot of America, really, until government got its act together. People armed themselves, or if they didn't, at least they found some way to defend themselves, and they looked after themselves and their neighbors, their family. And if somebody did them wrong in the absence of government, they would they would try to strike back, because the only way that they could keep from being wronged in the future was to have a reputation for being quite prickly, exacting some sort of price for any sort of wrong done to them. But there's a problem with this, even though it works fairly well, and people can live in the state of nature with this type of code of conduct quite well. So Locke goes on to make the point that he's not saying that people will be great judges in their own cases in the state of nature. People will execute the law of nature in disproportionate ways. That's why the feuds of the Hatfields and McCoys came to mind, those feuding hillbillies. Their feuds got out of hand. People tend to think that whatever wrong has been done to them is gargantuan, and the wrong that they do to others is a small matter. And so Locke is acknowledging that. He's saying, of course, people will object that, people should not be judge, jury, and executioner in the state of nature, because they're very partial to themselves and their friends, he says. And he's willing to admit that. He says, yes, that will be the case, and that's why he says the state of nature is inconvenient. He doesn't, like Hobbes, say that the state of nature is intolerable. He says it's inconvenient. And then he follows up by saying, but what is worse is absolute monarchy. He says, I shall desire those who make this objection to remember that absolute monarchs are but men, and if government is to be the remedy of those evils which necessarily follow from men's being judges in their own cases, and the state of nature is therefore not to be endured, I desire to know what kind of government that is, and how much better it is than the state of nature, where one man commanding a multitude has the liberty to be judge in his own case, and may do to all his subjects whatever he pleases. Okay, so you see the move that he's made there. He's basically saying that though the state of nature is inconvenient because of the way people are, they can get into feuds, they can become, the fearful, trigger-happy folks that Hobbes was writing about. So bad things are going to happen in the state of nature. But worse than that, in his view, would be to put all the power into the hands of one absolute monarch, who then has the power to be judge and jury over all and do whatever he pleases. That kind of power cannot be easily escaped. You can imagine in the state of nature, if you don't like that you're living next to the Hatfields, you could go someplace else. There's nothing that absolutely makes you stay in a particular area. You can move on if you need to, or you can hope that you can defeat them. There's hope of freedom, in other words. The inconvenience of being oppressed by somebody is a fleeting one, unlike dealing with an absolute government, which has the power to really turn everybody into slaves and to keep them that way, unless they wish to and can rebel. So having made that very important point that the state of nature is preferable to absolute monarchy, he then says, well, people may object that there never has been a state of nature. He says something very similar to what Hobbes says in response. He says all the rulers of the world are in a state of nature relative to each other. The state of international relations is a state of war, in other words. And then he also talks about the many people around the world that he doesn't really see as falling within a civil government, such as many of the indigenous peoples around the world, including the Indians in America he references. So that gets us through chapter 2. I think I'll stop there. Made some very important points that set up the rest of Locke's theory. So next we'll look at what Locke has to say about the state of war and of slavery, and both of those topics will further develop his argument against absolute monarchy in which all the power lies with a monarch, or even an absolute other type of absolute government. And is going to set the stage for arguing for a different type of government that is responsive to the people. And he's also going to be arguing for the right to revolution. All right, see you next time.